Right, good afternoon Year 11. This is the third presentation on creative writing. Hopefully you've watched the previous two. First one on how to use your planning time. Second one, yesterday's one, was on two important elements of creative writing: perspective and voice, and using alternative voices in your creative writing. As I said a couple of times before, this is all about, or it will be about, bringing all these elements together. Okay, so we're going to look at something else today. We are, as I said yesterday, going to look at some techniques that you can start using, which will improve your creative writing, and hopefully, the thing that I've been refocusing on, drawing it away from something which is very, very plot driven, something which is simply saying this happened, this happened. You do need to include an element of narrative. It is, after all, the focus of the question, particularly in the GCSE exam. But good narrative is about implementing, including and integrating good description as well within it. Okay, we're going to look at two things you could be using, two fundamental things. These aren't sort of details. This isn't what I'll be looking at tomorrow, which is a whole list of techniques that you can use, literary devices you can use, your similes, metaphors, personifications, all that type of thing. But moreover, it's looking at two sort of general ways in which you can make your creative writing, your narrative and descriptive writing, even better, particularly when it's in a limited word count, your 450 to 600 words. So, the first thing is a very, very common adage when it comes to creative writing, and that is show, don't tell. A lot of people say they know what it means, but actually when it comes to them actually doing some creative writing, it's evident that they don't. If you get it, it's absolutely fine. Just continue to practice it in the way that you are. If you don't get it, then I'll go through some stuff with you now. So the idea of show, don't tell is one of the most common associated with writing description and changing it into a creative narrative. What does it really mean? The key to creative writing is allowing the reader to access the world you are describing. So when you've got that relationship with a novel, when you've got a relationship with a story, a book that you're reading, really good ones, effective ones, are ones where you obviously can immerse yourself within it. To place themselves within the action, so the plot, however unbelievable and outlandish that might be, to picture the people and places, and very, very importantly, is to empathise with the emotions and sensations involved. So if you've got characters, be it what we were talking about yesterday from a first-person perspective or a third-person perspective, irrespective of the voice you are using, it's to do with the emotions and sensations of the characters they're in. And if you as the reader can somehow empathise with those, then it makes it effective, good creative writing. Part of this is obviously effective description itself. So if you're doing a visual image, you need to create that picture in the reader's mind's eye, which we'll come on to tomorrow, but its part is using those senses with which they can associate, which we can all associate with, and I'll be doing that later on in today's presentation, and partly leading them to draw their own interpretations, to make the story their own. And many, many people are sort of, when they're asked the question, what is your favourite book, what's your favourite story, it's because they've made their own interpretation of it. They've become part of it, and it's become part of them. I've often sort of referred to this chap called Roland Barthes, called Death of the Author. He wrote this essay some time ago, about 50 odd years ago now, called Death of the Author. And it's all about the idea, well, the flip side of Death of the Author is birth of the reader. When you have meanings in literature and meanings in novels and things like that, it's not so much the meaning that the writer intended, it's actually the meaning that the reader derives from it. Okay, so it's all about making these things our own. And a really good way of doing that is actually making it that the reader can empathise with what the writer's trying to say. The idea of show, don't tell is fundamental in this process, where it encourages the reader, through suggestion and inference, when we infer something, it's like a suggestion, to draw their own conclusions about a particular character, place or a situation. Obviously this is something which a good writer can use to manipulate, changing how we see things throughout the course of a narrative. What we perceive at one point we might reconsider later on, often by the inclusion of and what might appear to be tiny details. And I'm going to show you a couple of things that I've written here to demonstrate this. Okay, so one of the ways that you need to do it is starting very, very simply. Imagine that you are asked, so you're given your subject matter, your choice of 4. You've done your planning and you've worked out your perspective, you've worked out what you can do first or third, you've worked out the voice you're going to use and so on. And you're given the idea that you want your character to be anxious at the beginning. Again, if we go back to the one which is very, very common, this idea of something which is suspenseful or full of tension. Okay? So you want a character to be anxious. You want a character to be nervous. Because as soon as you do that, for example, you might pose the question to the reader, what are they nervous or anxious about? And why are they nervous and anxious? We could therefore simply start a piece written in third person saying the man was clearly, sorry, I should say the man was clearly nervous, or the man clearly was nervous. But that is telling us. That is telling us. It's telling us immediately what's the issue with the man. That trait in his character. However, if we look at it like this, okay, so you want to say that he's nervous or infer that he's nervous, but don't use that word nervous or synonyms, so words which are similar or the same of it. What details and descriptions of a sensation might show that a particular person is feeling the way that they are? So if you think yourself, if you go through that sensation of saying, right, what does it feel like to be nervous? What is the physical sensation of feeling nervous about? Now, there might be a number of things which you refer to. If you're writing something from the first person, it might be to do with heart beating. It might be to do with shortness of breath. It might be feeling a bit dizzy. It might be sort of sweaty palms. It might be a number of things. It might be sweat dripping down your forehead. It could be a number of things, bitten nails, all that type of stuff. Okay, we're doing this one in the third person. So I'm saying, first of all, make a list of 5 things or 5 characteristics that you might associate with being nervous. And obviously you can pause this as you need to. Okay. Having done that, you can then write a few sentences to describe, in the third person, someone who is nervous without using that word nervous or synonyms, anxious, anything like that at all. Now, if you do that, you're drawing the reader into saying, what's the issue with this person? If you tell them straight where they're nervous, you haven't got that dynamic. You haven't got the relationship with the reader and the writer. But if you're actually getting the reader to think, what is going on with this character? Why are they doing what they're doing? And they come to an interpretation or a conclusion that that particular character is nervous, then they're drawn into the text much, much more. Okay? So try it. Write down 5 things. They can be quite quick. Just scribble them down, 5 things you might associate with nervousness, and then write it up into sentence form. Okay? Now, here's one that I've done for you. So obviously a couple of ideas that you might use there if you can't actually rely on your own sort of observations of sensations about a particular emotion. I've simply written at the bottom, the man sat in the chair. Okay, so we're starting off with the man sat in the chair. That's what you can start your one off with. The man sat in the chair, constantly shifting his weight from haunch to haunch, okay? Constantly crossing his legs, crossing them one way, then the other, contorting and twisting his body. Now I've got that observation of someone that's sitting there doing that, agitated, moving around, crossing their legs one way, crossing them another, twisting their body. We might get a sense of nervousness, but I haven't actually used that word at all. His hands too, sorry, bear with me, I bet you're missing these. His hands too were in constant movement, moving around his face like scurrying ants. And at this stage, we're going to go through this sort of thing tomorrow, but if you want to include some imagery, similes and things like that, of course you can do. His hands, constant movement, moving around his face like scurrying ants, rubbing his furrowed brow, wiping the beads of sweat which glazed his forehead. His fingers either wrapped within clenched in fists, or inserted in nibbling mouth. Sorry about the syntax of the last one there. But the point I'm making is none of it is to do with actually saying he is this, he was this. It's simply observations about him to tell the reader that he is nervous. Now, it can work the other way around as well. So not creating it, you might be interpreting something here. And there's another piece that I've written. See, I'll read this to you. But more than just seeing what it interprets about the person, you might be able to tell some really obvious things about the person from the piece of writing you've done. but you might be able to actually interpret something pretty much individual to you. There's a famous poet called Tennyson who actually wrote that I'm a part of all I've met. So it might be your individual experiences lead you to interpret something about this which I hadn't. Death of the author, birth of the reader, even though I wrote it. She moved around the room slowly, latching her gnarled hands onto any surface for support. The well-polished tabletop, the back of chairs. Eventually she arrived at the cage of a bright yellow canary, tapping on the slender bars with slender fingers, pursing her thin lips into a faint whistle. The bird hopped on its perch like a spark. She smiled softly and moved to the window, parting the jaundiced net curtain, peering through the slit to the grey world beyond. She sighed and looked at the clock on the mantelpiece, a clock paraded among photographs of smiling generations of her family. It was 9 o'clock in the morning. Okay? Now, what impressions, what interpretations can you make from the she in this? Okay? So you might want to pause it and just read through what I've written there, and it might be you come back to saying, well, I can tell this about this character because this is what I've been shown, not told. I can tell. The reader. Okay? So it might be, as we go through this, asking questions like, why is it, so I'll put my glasses on at this point, why is it that she moves around that room slowly? What might that tell us about her? And we may not know things straight away. We may have to read a little bit further to make our interpretations of it. Latching her gnarled hands. Now what does gnarled mean? Unlike my big man hands, but gnarled. Okay, almost like the twigs of a branch or twigs on a stick. So what might that tell us about her? The fact that she's having to move from surface to surface slowly. What might that tell us about her? What might it tell us about her that the tabletop is well polished? What might it tell us about her that she arrives at this bird cage of the canary, and there she taps on the windows with her slender fingers? And why she got thin lips, and why is she feeling the need to have the relationship with a canary, a caged bird? Is that telling us something? Is that another technique which we'll be looking at tomorrow that I've used in the brief piece of writing? Why is it that she smiled softly? What might be in the softness of that smile about this particular character? You can see that I'm talking in terms of details here. And she moves to the window, parting the jaundice curtain. Jaundice means yellow. So it might be they're old or dirty. Peering through the slit to the grey world beyond. Why is it that she sees the world beyond her space as grey? Why does she sigh? Why does she look at the mantelpiece? Why is the clock so important and the concluding time so important? What might it tell us about her that she sighs when she looks at that clock and sees all the photographs of her smiling family there? Okay? There might be a great deal in that which you are interpreting. I haven't told you stuff about that character beyond here what she's doing. What might it be? Have a think. So, suggestion is that you probably got is she's an old lady. The suggestion is that she's lonely within her existence. These are making deductions about things. When we deduce, we don't know. When we deduce, we make informed guesses. When we deduce, we look at the information we have and say, I can't be absolutely certain, but I think actually I can make an informed guess about this. So we can guess that she is old, maybe from the way she moves around the room. We guess that she is frail, having to support herself. We can guess that she is lonely and probably that she is sad. We can guess that she misses her family. We can guess maybe that things aren't particularly going to change for this old person. Okay? Now, if you are asked to write something about an old woman, okay, think about the structure I've given you before. Maybe you could start off with 100, 150 words like that, and then maybe you can have something where she sits down in her chair and she remembers what it was to be young again. What might be the agent of change, the thing that makes her think that? Well, it could be the ticking clock, it could be something like that. But you can see what I've said before, that you can have very sort of poignant and sensitive and sentimental things here, which don't have to be epic and dramatic, but full of feeling, and then she returns back to that present day. Maybe there is a knock on the door, maybe there is a ray of hope at the end. But again, remember what I said about planning, make sure that actually you know how it's going to end before you put pen to paper at the beginning. Now that would be quite a nice story, an old lady like this, feeling lonely, and our sentiments for her, our emotions, we feel sympathy for her, we feel sadness for her. And then it might be that she has this memory of the past. And then maybe we come back to the present and there is that knock on the door and there are members of her family there for her and it ends on a happy note. Okay? But you could be thinking about narratives like that. Another example. Okay? This one is based on place. So, my senses were assaulted by this place. The odour of earth invaded my nostrils, earth and damp wood. The sound, though, was both deafening and constant. But there was nothing I could pinpoint from which any sound emanated. The chatterings, the screechings, the howls. I found my head frantically spinning around, looking up into the green canopy of foliage above, through which shafts of fly-filled sunlight penetrated, and a sense of movement everywhere, creeping, slithering, and scurrying, though I could see none, just that things were close. Okay? Now again, in this I haven't mentioned anything at all about the about the location, just maybe a clue or two. Okay? Now it might again be an obvious thing, but it is a jungle. Okay, or at least a rainforest, something like that. And the deduction we might make from it, not only is it a jungle, but it is threatening and dark. If I'd simply started my piece telling you I'm in a jungle, okay, then you've given it away. But in doing it this way, or this way about a particular character, you're handing it over to the reader to actually really engage with what you've written. So show don't tell is a really fundamental and good way of actually using your creative writing. Okay, just be mindful of it, slowing it down, thinking about the details. We're going to have another look at a different type of detail now. Okay, now again, this is quite a hackneyed idea. This idea of referring to senses in your creative writing. But it does couple up with what I've just said about show and tell. And one of the things you probably would have seen, obviously those are the senses there for you. One of the things you probably have noticed in the two bits of writing I just did, that pretty much in the second one throughout, but definitely in the first one as well, there were clear references to senses. And it wasn't like I was, particularly in the first one, it wasn't like I was thinking, right, I've got to include all the senses here, but you have a sort of sense of there is something to do with touch, there is something in the polished wood, there is something to do with the sound of her whistling to the little bird, there is movement in there as well. There's also, we don't get much taste in there, but you know, we could do more with it. In the second one, I very deliberately put in, there is an odour, there is a smell there. You get the sense of movement everywhere, even though it's unseen. You get the light coming through as well. Okay, you get the sounds as well. So I'm really trying to actually engage the reader with a picture of a place or person by actually appealing to those senses. And of course, they do say that the closest sense to our own memory is smell. Okay, it's a difficult one to do, but okay. Now, some of you might have seen this before, okay, and it's something that I'll put on the, I'll send out to you all, okay, and you can just use it as you wish. It's sort of like a senses diagram, if you like. So we have our senses, we have sight, sound, smell, touch, and taste. Obviously, some of those are easier to describe and use in your creative writing than others, okay. Now, based on that, okay, it might be that we have particular places. You can change this as you like. You can put particular people around the outsides, okay? It doesn't mean you have to include every sense for every single thing that you try and do. But when you actually plan your piece, and I'll bring this all together for you tomorrow, when you plan your piece, you can be thinking, well, in my description of this particular place or person or incident or situation, I'm going to try and include not just what happened, because we know that's a no-go, not simply the things that I see, but also other senses in there too. By way of example, okay, if I said, right, a place, and I know a couple of groups I've done this with, but I have actually changed other ones for you to look at as well. If I said, right, a kaleidoscope of light bulbs is something I see, it's a detail. There could be loads of details about this place, but a kaleidoscope of light bulbs, and a kaleidoscope being one of those things you put up to your eye and turn, and actually has different patterns and colours. Where might that be? If I said, in terms of the sound of screams of girls, okay, it might make it a little bit more sort of familiar to you, but you're thinking, well, what exactly? The smell of burnt sugar. Now that's obviously, I've put there in brackets, to do with candy floss. You are not saying the thing, not saying the smell of candy floss, because what you want to do is describe the sense, not simply say what the thing is. So the smell of burnt sugar, the stickiness of a crisply coated toffee apple. We all have the sensation when you've bitten into a toffee apple, the stickiness on your lips initially, the crunch of that sort of crystallized sugar, and then into the dustiness, if you like, of the apple within, the flesh of the apple within. And that is very much to do with the touch. It doesn't have to be the things which you touch or touch you. It can be other sensations as well to do with that. Taste, the sickly sweet sugariness of a stick of rock. Okay. So if you're guessing by a show don't tell, but also reference the senses there, what that place was, probably the conclusion that you come up with correctly would be a funfair. But there could be thousands of different things that you could do there. So do your own senses diagram and actually think to yourself, well, in the details, not simply writing the big wheel, the roller coaster of things like that, but details. Details of the things that sound. The sound of girls screaming could be, unfortunately, pretty much anything. But actually in the context of this one, as they oscillate on those roller coasters. So I could say the oscillating screams, oscillations from science, you know, being that, waves. Okay, is the movement of the roller coaster. If we look at another one, okay, the shimmer of sunlight on waves. Something we see. The screech of circling seagulls. So I've used sibilants there. Okay, screech, circling seagulls. If you are given a place to write about, rather than sort of simply saying in the first sentence, the telling, this is the place I'm writing about, it's about conjuring the details. So the reader again can say, yes, I can sort of pick up on that detail, but more than just the visual detail, I can pick up other sensory details as well. Okay? Drifts of salty frying batter on the breeze. So where is it you might actually get that? Smell of frying batter on a salty breeze. The smoothness of a pebble in your hand, and they probably are getting there. I defy anyone who goes to this particular place not to pick up a pebble and actually just feel it in the palm of their hand. Okay? The coldness of it as well. And finally the tangy sharpness of salt and vinegar on chips, and again you've probably guessed very much the senses we might associate with the British seaside. Okay? But never have I mentioned the word seaside. Never have I mentioned the word British seaside. Okay? But there could be other details. Even looking at the picture there, you know, that blue and white stripe sort of thing on the back of deck chairs is something we associate very, very much with Britain. The sound of pebbles. If you're looking at something again, the touch, the difficulty in sort of wading your way up the pebbles up the shore. Okay? The screech of people running into the sea. Okay, another one. Palm leaves waving lazily. Where might you see that? Where might you hear waves washing up the beach? Use of alliteration. We're sort of looking at techniques tomorrow. The sweet smell of coconut milk. We're looking at something similar, the coolness of suntan lotion on tight burnt skin. Okay? And again, sometimes these senses are difficult to define, to think about. But this is the whole point of creative writing. It's creative. You've got to use your imagination. And the sweet taste of mango and passion fruit. And obviously there we have a seaside, but a fundamentally different one in a tropical seaside. Okay? But very, very different in terms of the senses we're looking at. Now, what you can do, you don't have to do this and this, you can simply write in list form if you can't be bothered to print this off or anything like that. But simply write down a place, and I've got some examples here. You could write down a place and think about 1, 2, 3, 4, maybe, details you can put in there with each sense. Not simply writing down the thing, but describing the sense. So, you might choose, what might a bonfire party? What sights might you see at a bonfire party? Not just writing fireworks, describe the fireworks. In metaphors and similes if you want to. What sounds might you hear at a bonfire party? The crackles of the fireworks in the sky. The coos of people as they look up there. The crying child needed to be hugged by his father because he's scared. Little details again like that. What smells are very evocative of that. The cordite of the bonfire of that, the gunpowder almost, on the breeze there. But it might be other things, the food which you associate with it as well. What is the touch of it? Remember that feeling when you have a sparkler in between your fingers, maybe in gloved hands. Okay? What about taste that you might associate with it as well? Taste is probably the most difficult one to describe. How about doing this one? So, snowy woodland. I've changed these ones for people who've done this exercise before, so try these ones as well. Again, it's very, very difficult. I've made some of these gradually more difficult. The sight of it is quite easy. Don't just put snow everywhere. What does it look like? But the sounds of it might be, is there just a silence? That sort of flump as snow falls off branches that sometimes you hear. Okay? Think about the smell of that. Is there just a cleanliness smell? Well, there might be a cottage somewhere nearby, and the smell of wood burning. Okay? This one, rain in the city. You might think touch is quite a difficult one, but in looking at this picture, we can all associate with the slipperiness of leaves on a wet pavement. Okay? Try that one yourself. Then, countryside, on a summer's day. We can all think about what it looks like, but again, the detail, not just the field. Think about the corn waving in that field. What about the sounds of things, down to little things moving around? That's what you might really associate with that. The smell, what are the smells of that? Particularly if you smell suffering from hay fever. The touch of things, the sun on your skin, the breeze, and the taste. What taste do you associate with the British countryside? Okay. You might choose to do something very, very personal. And that's where this is about evoking memory. Okay? By way of example, there's a shed there. When I think of my own father, I often do think about he had a shed. Okay? And he was a meticulous person. And the shed, all his tools in the shed were always in the right way in the outline of where that particular tool went. So it might be, I would say, for here, the site would be the outline, black outline of a hammer. Okay? When it comes to the things that was sound in there, he'd always have a little transistor radio playing some jazz music. Okay? And even if it's just the undertone of it, might be what I remember rather than the actual tune. And describing that, the crackliness of it. What's the smell I associate with it? Well, it was a shed. It smelt of wood, and it smelt of resin, and it smelt of those sort of things, but it also smelt of cigarettes and aftershave, because it was my father. When did the touch of things, the smoothness of that bench, maybe, okay? The latch as it went in. And the taste? Well, sometimes we used to have lunch in there. My father was not the greatest cook, so we used to have sardines on toast pretty much every time. I can just always remember the taste of that whenever I take it. Now, I think of that place, and that's how it works. It might be that there is one of these things which suddenly can happen in the course of your day, and it sends you back on that temporal journey and that time journey to a completely different place and person. And that's what this evocative writing is all about. That's why show don't tell is so important, because you're not simply presenting it, you're getting people to think. Secondly, it's to do with those senses, and how senses can evoke something very, very special in a piece of writing. Now, what you can be doing going forward. Obviously, you can test yourself in terms of the previous exercises. Obviously, you can try it in terms of the show, don't tell. Describe a person, describe a place, whatever it might be, okay? But don't use the words to describe their particular point you're trying to make about them. Think back to the other exercises you've done, when you had two people walking into the room, contrastingly with different voices, but maybe you could have one of them as nervous, one of them as confident, but you're not saying nervous and confident, it's how they relate to each other. You could try that. But also, you can either do it like this, try this as well. I've done it with places, you can do it with people as well. Places is quite a good one, and it sets the scene very well, because, as I said, it engages the reader and draws them in. Next presentation, so tomorrow's, I'll simply be looking at other literary techniques, simple literary techniques that you've probably done in previous years. How you might integrate them into your plan, and then we can bring all this together into narratives. Hope that's been useful.